We're going to pick up tonight in the topics that we were in the midst of the last couple times. We've been looking at the theology of the body. So the church's teaching with regard to who God has made us as men and women. So sexual teaching about in the church's teaching sometimes can be some of the more difficult kinds of teaching because the world can be very much opposed to what the Catholic Church teaches. And her teaching in this area is perhaps more developed and slightly different from some of the other Christian denominations as well, though certainly there's also overlap. So, the theology of the body, remember, was a set of teachings from Pope John Paul II, and his teachings are obviously based off of scriptural and the tradition of the church that goes much earlier than himself. But he specifically developed his theology of the body in response to the sexual revolution. And the continuation of the sexual revolution continues within our culture today. We looked at kind of, the order of how we got to where we are now with regard to what's being proposed as good in the area of human sexuality. We looked at various moments that as you begin to erode the full meaning of what marriage, the sexual act between husband and wife, when we begin to erode those truths, then it just goes step by step as to the next thing is being proposed as something good and moral, right? So divorce, contraception, so no-fault divorce removes the permanence from the unitive meaning of marriage. Contraception removes procreation from sex and marriage, so it tries to have sex and marriage without procreation. Going to abortion, abortion becomes the backup of contraception when it doesn't work. It's a contraceptive mentality that leads to the insistence in our culture that we must have abortion. In this area of playing God with human life with regard to sexuality, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy then goes the opposite direction. We now are trying to create life, but we're doing it apart from the unitive aspect of the husband and wife within marriage. And so that's going to lead us now to where we're going to pick up today, and we're going to talk about same-sex relations and same-sex marriage. So same-sex relations actually it kind of follows with this separation of the sexual act and procreation, because that's what same-sex relations do. It's the removal of procreation and the need of biological complementarity, which is required for procreation, from the sexual act. And says, well, we now can change the purpose and meaning of the sexual act to something that's completely separated from the possibility of new life being able to come into existence. So let's talk about what the church teaches with regard to same-sex attraction, because some people can be confused. And before we kind of go into it, begin thinking, remember, one of the principles of theology of the body was that, the act, any human act, in order for it to be fully human, must express love. And that love is defined by God's love, because God is love. And so we looked at 4 characteristics of God's love, that his love is free, total, faithful, and fruitful. So we've been applying those characteristics to each of these different ones. So before we get into it in greater detail, same-sex attraction and the actions that would go with that, free, total, faithful, fruitful, anything missing from there? Yeah, certainly the fruitfulness is impossible because that requires the biological complementarity between husband and wife. So let's continue and see what the church says. Some people will think, well, didn't Pope Francis a number of years ago, didn't he say that it's all right? Didn't he say it's okay? And you may even hear them use a phrase that he himself used, who am I to judge? Right? Who am I to judge? You know, so here's a quote. If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? And so some people will then take that and say, see, the church has accepted it, or at least Pope Francis, even if the church hasn't formally taught that same-sex attraction is all right. Well, let's look at the context of that quote. It's been quite a few years now since he made it. And that was back in 2013 is when he spoke the quote, but that who am I to judge continues to pop up. So here's the context. So to tell you, he was in a press conference that he was giving while he was on a flight back from Rio de Janeiro from World Youth Day. So he didn't have notes and everything in front of him, and it wasn't a prepared, document that he was writing. So that should help you. He's talking to press. So he says, if someone is gay and is searching for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? The Catechism of the Catholic Church explains this in a beautiful way, saying, wait a moment, what does it say? How does it say it? It says, no one should marginalize these people for this. They must be integrated into society. The problem is not having this tendency. No, we must be brothers and sisters to one another. So, right after he says, who am I to judge, he begins by saying, well, we should look at the Catechism if you want to know what the church teaches with regard to that, right? And of course, he's trying to remember what it says, but I mean, who of us have the Catechism memorized, right? Not even the Pope. So don't feel if you don't have it memorized. So let's see where he's trying to quote. So here's the Catechism, paragraph 2358 is the one that it seems like he's trying to quote. The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible, right? So the church is recognizing that this is a real issue for certain people. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial, right? We'll come back and talk about that objectively disordered portion. But there, the highlighted part seems to be what Pope Francis is trying to emphasize. He says, they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided, right? So, obviously, every single human being we've talked about before has been made in God's image and likeness, right? And has infinite worth and dignity. And so that's what he's saying, is that we must treat every single person, including those who have this inclination, with respect and compassion. They should not be discriminated against, right? Because there have been times in which those with same-sex attraction have been singled out, and even violence has been carried out against them, and that's not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable towards any human being, regardless of whoever they are, whatever they do, right? We must treat them as human beings. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they're Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. So, which, you may notice that that last thing applies to every person that exists, right? So we'll find here that when it comes with regard to the church's teaching about sexuality, in particular, and also in this case with same-sex attraction, the church doesn't single out anybody. The church calls everyone to the same standard of holiness, regardless of what kind of tendencies or inclinations, temptations we might have. All right. The Catechism actually continues. This is not it. This is the previous paragraph. Also goes into, it says, homosexuality refers to relations between men and women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction towards persons of the same sex. It has been given a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures, right? So it's recognizing this is not something new. Human condition hasn't suddenly changed. This has existed. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained, right? So it's not trying to get into the scientific details as to why some people may experience it. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, right? They're contrary to the natural law. they close the sexual act to the gift of life, right? We already talked about that, right? Free, total, faithful, fruitful, it's exclusionary of the fruitful aspect. They do not proceed from a genuine affection and sexual complementarity, right? The complementarity between men and women is missing. Under no circumstances can they be approved, right? So that should be pretty clear as to how the church understands it. But we'll go into a little greater detail here, especially with the terms intrinsically disordered that we saw. We saw intrinsically disordered here, and here objectively disordered. All right. So, because sometimes people will think that because the church uses that term, that, well, that means someone who experiences this are worse than other people in some way. And that's not going to be true. All right, so what does this objectively or intrinsically disordered mean? So let's make a distinction, and this is a distinction that we make for everything within the Catholic Church. There are things that can be disordered that aren't ordered properly to the way God has made us, and they can be within us a temptation to act upon a disordered desire. And then there is the actual choice to do it, which is a sin. Right? So here's the question. Same-sex attraction, is it disordered? Yes. That was very clear. Same-sex attraction, is that a sin? No, it isn't. We'll come back to that in a second. The actions, therefore. So, are the actions disordered? Yes. So if the attraction is disordered, then to act upon those attractions would then also be disordered. So same-sex attraction, though itself isn't sinful. It is a disordered desire, and we can have many different disordered desires, some of which we may not choose, right? It constitutes a temptation. It's only when the same-sex attraction turns into action, when one chooses and acts upon it, then that's when it becomes a sin. Right? So, and this is an important distinction because sometimes, well, we'll see here in a little bit, that people will come to so associate their whole beings with the attraction and the action that they choose to do based on the attraction, that when the church uses this term objectively disordered, they think, well, you're calling me objectively disordered. Well, no, we're not calling you objectively disordered. We're calling that inclination objectively disordered. But guess what? Every single one of us have objectively disordered desires that we have tendencies toward, right? That's why we sin, because we have temptations toward that. So this same-sex attraction is one of the different disordered desires that one can be tempted towards. We'll come back to that here. So here's the context, here's some more context of that quote from Pope Francis when they were asking him. They were asking him about a gay lobby, so individuals that are trying to push this as a lifestyle. He says, you spoke about the gay lobby. I believe that when you are dealing with such a person, you must distinguish between the fact of a person being gay and the fact of someone forming a lobby, because not all lobbies are good. This one is not good. And then you have that quote part where he says, you know, who am I to judge? The problem is not having this tendency. No, we must be brothers and sisters to one another. The problem is making a lobby of this tendency. Right? So he, in that sense, is making that same distinction, right? He says the problem isn't the tendency, right? The attraction. Even though it's disordered, we all have those, right? But that in of itself isn't sinful. But the problem, he says, is making a lobby of this, right? In other words, let's make it a way of life. Let's purposely choose to act out upon that, right? So he's making that distinction, that there's a difference between individuals who experience same-sex attraction while at that time trying to follow God, right? Which is any of us with any disordered desire in our life, right? We may fall into our disordered desires and even choose them at times, but are we striving to follow God in the midst of struggling against our disordered desires? Versus, he says, those that push the acceptance of the same-sex lifestyle, right? That would be the difference between, someone who is, gives up and says, I don't care if it's a sin, I'm just going to do it anyway, right? And that doesn't necessarily, it could be any sin, right? But as I alluded to, what's difficult with regard to same-sex attraction is the way that it has been portrayed as a life-defining aspect of the person, right? The way that, it's described as people coming out or revealing basically to everyone that they have these attractions, right? Self-disclosure of their orientation or also their gender identity, we'll come to that here later. And now we can understand why someone would do that, because they're trying to understand who they are and the desires that they have. And sexual desires are so strong and very much defining of a person that it can feel like this is the most important thing about myself. And I want other people to accept me for who I am, right? Nothing wrong at all with that. And there may even be, because I feel different, there may even be this kind of feelings of shame, and part of that is actually part of God's design, right? Because we talked about shame points out when something's not quite ordered right. And so if the desire isn't quite ordered right, then there's some shame for that. But we can also have disordered shame, right? Where our shame doesn't match the level of our, we begin to have shame for the wrong things. So they're trying to feel more normal. And so what ends up happening in this kind of lobby or the LGBT community and those that are promoting it is that individuals begin to define the core of their identity upon the experiences of their sexual attractions and behaviors, right? That now this is who I am, right? And it comes in, we can see this just by the way it gets labeled, right? I am this. I have this identity. And now we even have all the different gender identities, right? I am defining who I am by these various experiences of my sexuality, whatever it may be, right? And it also, they're also searching for a community as well. And it may be the only community they can find, especially if they have been rejected or feel they've been rejected by family, friends, those that are close to them. So we can understand why a person would begin to put their identity in that. But the problem is that the church can't accept that because we shouldn't put our identity in in anything not ordered properly within us, or even ordered properly. Our identity should not be in just one aspect of us, right? Yes, we are sexual beings, but our sexual desires and attractions should not define the core of who we are. Let me give you a scriptural example to help us think through this a little more. So, Mark's Gospel, we have the story of a woman who is suffering from hemorrhages. And it says that she had been afflicted with this for 12 years. And so this is going to be a major illness, really defining her whole life, right, as to how she has to live. But connected to this is also that not only is this so impactful that it's beginning to define her life, other people are defining her based upon it as well. In the Jewish culture, because of this illness, it would have made her ritually impure. She would not be able to come and participate in the prayer in the temple courtyard where the women would come. So she was impure and basically isolated from that aspect of her religious culture, right? And so you can imagine that over time, this is going to be her identity that's going to arise within her. She is the impure woman, right? And if enough people say this about you, you can begin to believe it, right? This is who I am. And all this, I think, is apt because, sometimes people will argue, well, same-sex attraction may not have been a choice for this person, right? It may have been something that it just occurred, and so how can they be responsible? They should be able just to simply live out those and attractions. Well, in here, this woman also didn't define what she's going through. But in a similar event, they're allowing this one aspect of their life to define who they are. But this is an important account because Jesus is going to come and she's going to reveal to her her actual identity, right? Because none of those things are what define us. And Jesus' interaction, this is how he talks to her. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction. So in this, Jesus gives back to her her identity. She is a daughter, right? She is God's daughter. She's a beloved daughter of the Father. She's not an impure woman, right? And this is the key for the way the church understands, and why the church is opposed to this kind of lobbying for having people identify with these experiences of their sexuality, because that's not the core of their identity. The core of their identity is that we are all beloved children of God, including those individuals, right? So, and you may notice that when I'm talking about this, I'll use the term same-sex attraction, right? I'm not going to use the labels that society uses. I mean, the Pope did, a little bit there, but in the church talking about it, there's a difference between labeling a person and defining them based upon this versus this is an experience that they're having. And it may be a major experience that they're having, but it doesn't need to be defining and ought not to be defining of their identity. Right? So that's a core understanding of how the church can say this attraction is disordered. The attraction itself isn't a sin, but when you act upon it, which is what, if you identify yourself with those attractions, you end up being pushed to live out the lifestyle, then those become sinful. Right? And so the church wants to give freedom to those individuals who are experiencing this by revealing to them their true identity, that they're beloved sons and daughters of the Father, right? So far from the church wanting to exclude or think individuals with same-sex attraction are bad, we have great love for every human being, and in particular those that struggle with various, desires that are not ordered properly. But that's all of us that live in a fallen world. We all have different disordered desires. That's why we all need Jesus. So the church calls every single person to that continued conversion. Related to same-sex relations is the issue of same-sex marriage. Right? So let's talk about, here I have, same-sex relations remove procreation from the sexual act. Same-sex marriage then removes procreation and that need of biological complementarity from what marriage is, right? And so now we've eroded what the meaning of marriage as unitive and procreative given by God all the way to the point now where we're including other things as being marriage. So let's look at same-sex marriage. This was in 2015 when the Supreme Court Oberfeld versus Hodges decision occurred that gave same-sex couples the legal right to marriage. I'm putting in quotes because their understanding of marriage is very different from the Catholic understanding of marriage. The majority opinion from the justices, they say in that decision, their hope is about those desiring same-sex marriage, say their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law, right? So they're saying that unless those individuals can have marriage, then they have less dignity. But is that true? If you're unable to marry, do you have less dignity? There's certainly plenty of people who are unable to marry, or choose not to marry, or that don't. Marriage doesn't give us greater dignity than we already have. But Also, we'll come back to this loneliness aspect too. So, the catchphrase at the time, there's been others since then, but love wins, right? So now we can have institutionalized whatever form of love that we want. But the thing is that it depends upon what you mean by love in this case. So if we go all the way back into Greek philosophy, in the Greek language, they had more words for love than we do. We use the word love for all sorts of different types of love, and we don't often make the distinction between them. But when you say, I love my wife or I love my children, you're saying something very different from when you say I love ice cream. They're not the same thing. But so in Greek, they have 4 different words for love, and they kind of help us break down the kinds of love that there are. So one love is a kind of natural affection or liking. That would be storge. Philia is friendship love between 2 friends. Eros is sexual desire. And agape is the self-sacrificial love that's talked about in the scriptures. So God's love is agape love. So when they say love wins, they're really focusing on one part of love. They're focusing on the eros, the sexual desire part of love. That now sexual desire can be institutionalized and supported in this area of same-sex relations. But the reality of this is that they've kind of eliminated the other aspects of love. And so love becomes less, because love is now only sexual love, as though that's the only way to love another human being, right? Because that was the thing, is that they need love, right? Because this is the only way we're going to escape loneliness, right? Is that if we can engage in love, and love, being sexual desire, means that we have to be able to institutionalize our actions. But it's a reduction of what love is. Love and the intimate knowing of the other person through love is different just simply from the sexual act. Sex and intimacy are not the same thing. We can survive without having sex. No one has ever died because they didn't have it, right? But we can't survive without intimacy, right? We can actually die without intimacy. There's a story, I think it was like from the Middle Ages, where they were going to run an experiment with some babies, infants, to see. They were going to, no one would speak to them. The babies wouldn't speak to them because they wanted to find out, well, what kind of language would these infants learn, right? If they're nurses and, if no one spoke any language to them. So do you know what language they learned? They never found out, because they all died. Because they lacked intimacy, right? They didn't have that intimacy, and they couldn't survive without it, right? So we can't survive without intimacy, which is this deepest connection with another person, where you reveal yourself to the other and the other reveals yourself to them. But this is very different. Sex can be an intimate moment, but it might not also be one, right? It can also be bereft of intimacy as well. So you can't equate the two. But if you reduce the meaning of love, then suddenly the only way to have intimacy is through those bodily actions. So that's another thing the church is going to say, no, this is a reduction of what love really is. Also, what this does is it's going to completely change the way that we understand marriage, right? There's a reason why same-sex relations cannot be marriage. Because in our theology, marriage reveals the Trinity, right? So remember, God in and of himself is a a trinity of persons. A father gives his whole self to his son, the son gives his whole self to the father, and the love between them is so real that it is a third person, the Holy Spirit. Well, marriage is modeled after that, right? The father gives his whole self to his wife, the wife gives his whole self to her husband, and the love between them is so real that there's a possibility of a third person coming from that, of their children, right? So it's modeled after the very Trinity. But if we try to say marriage includes same-sex relations, then suddenly this has to go away. This can't be true anymore. Marriage is no longer something that reveals the very love of the Trinity, right? So you see, there's what's at stake here for us as Christians is the very theology of what marriage is. If we were to say same-sex marriage is all right. Also, remember we talked about in marriage, the love between husband and wife is also modeled after the love between Jesus and the church, right? So the husband is to offer his life like Jesus offered his life for his bride, and she then is also supposed to give herself totally back to him, right? So the complementarity between Christ and the bride is removed when you have same-sex marriage. Right, because you no longer have a bride and a groom anymore, right? So if same-sex marriage were to be accepted by the church, it would mean we'd have to throw out this part of our theology as well, right? And of course, I mean, Paul is very clear that of this sacramental nature of what marriage is all about. Though I would say that, you know, maybe if you're talking to people who don't have a Christian background, they might not be impressed with theology. So how do we talk about this without necessarily bringing theology into it? Because for us as Catholics, this is not just a theology reason why the church would reject same-sex marriage. It's also on the order of natural law, that anyone can understand why same-sex marriage should not be accepted. And that is connected, though, to one of the ends of marriage. That of children. All right? So we're not just imposing our faith on society when we say we don't want to accept same-sex marriage, but rather we can talk about it in terms of, well, what is marriage for? Right? What is it? So we can compare a couple different definitions. We have society's definition. They don't necessarily, I would say, have a definition, but try to write a definition for them, right? Marriage is the public recognition of a committed relationship between a man and a woman or two adults for their fulfillment, right? So it's very much focused on the adults, right? For now. What if in the future that changes and they decide we're going to redefine it even more? Marriage is a public recognition of a committed relationship between two persons, regardless of age. Or marriage is a public recognition of a committed relationship between a person and whatever, right? What's to stop society from changing that? Instead, on the other side, we have a definition that doesn't invoke our faith at all, but it is a natural law type definition. Marriage unites a man and a woman to each other and to any children born from that union, right? This is the purpose of marriage, is to unite a man and a woman together and to the children that come from that, right? So it's within that we see the two ends of marriage, right? The unitive, it's uniting the man and the woman, and the procreative, and the children that come from it. But it's not speaking in terms of a theology. This is a very much a natural level kind of thing. So this is going to be the definition that we could use to talk to people that don't necessarily have faith as a alternative to what society proposes for that. So it unites a husband and a wife. It unites moms and dads to their children. Right? That's what marriage is for, uniting the moms and dads to each other and to their children. Because here's a question. Does everyone have a mom and a dad? What do you think? Does everyone have a mom and dad? Biologically, it is impossible not to have a mom and a dad. A new human life requires genetic material from both the mother and the father. Well, what about orphans? Do they have a mom and a dad? Yes. The tragedy is that the mom and the dad are not there, right? That's the tragedy for them. What about children with deceased parents? Do they have a mom and a dad? They do, but it so happens their parents have died. What about children of a single parent? Do they have a mom and a dad? They still have a mom and a dad. One is missing, though, from that. What about children who have adopted parents? Do they have a mom and a dad? They still have their biological mom and dad, but they also have been given this gift of for whatever reason, that mom and dad maybe not be able to be in the picture in their life, and so they have another mom and a dad. Divorced parent, children of divorced parents, do they have a mom and a dad? Yes, but once again, maybe they're not able to have both of them at the same time. What about children of same-sex parents? Do they have a mom and a dad? They do. But we'll have to talk about that a little bit more. What about children created through IVF or surrogacy or egg and sperm donation? Do they have a mom and a dad? They do, right? All human beings have a mom and a dad. There is no one who exists who don't have a mom and a dad. But the question then is, can we purposely exclude a mom and a dad from a child? Right? Because that is what is at issue through a number of these things, including same-sex marriage, is that adults are deciding that we are going to purposefully exclude a parent, or maybe both parents, from that child. All right? So marriage, on a natural level, is meant to unite moms and dads to their children. Right? That's what the Institute of Marriage is all about. But adults can make choices that separate them from their children. Right? And so divorce, unfortunately, that's why it hurts children so much. There's a quote from Pope Francis in one of his audiences that he gave. Do we feel the weight of the mountain that crushes the soul of a child in those families where members mistreat and hurt one another to the point of breaking the bonds of marital fidelity? When adults lose their head, when each one thinks only of him or herself, when a dad or mom hurt one another, the souls of their children suffer terribly. They experience a sense of despair, and these wounds leave a mark that lasts their whole lives. Right? So it's not to say that children of divorced parents, are not going to be able to function the rest of their life, but we have to be honest and recognize that there's a wound there. That when the institution of marriage, when mothers and fathers are separated from each other and their children, there's something missing there that has an effect, in particular, upon children, right? And so we must be very careful and not be so flippant as to say, we can go ahead and willy-nilly separate children from their mothers and fathers, right? Because here's the question: how do same-sex couples have children? Right? They can't biologically have them together. That's not possible. How are they going to have children? Well, they have to use adoption. So death, divorce, abandonment is going to be, behind that in some shape or form. And then otherwise, they'll have to use third-party reproduction, like the things we've talked about earlier, that we already talked about. This would be another reason why the church is going to be against those things, is because it breaks the children apart from their parents. So in other words, with regard to same-sex families, or there's no such thing as an intact household. It's not possible. It is always going to be a broken, a fractured with the children from their parents. Right? And so this is a natural level that we could talk to people who may not be impressed by the church's theology, but just on a practical, natural level. And if you talk to actually children that come from same-sex households, I'm not going to play the video here, but she is one of them. They're now adults now, and though they say we can love our same-sex parents, what about the missing parent, right? What about the missing father, the missing mother? Oh. All right. So, related closely to the issue of same-sex relations and same-sex marriage, almost immediately as that was accepted in society, we moved right on to the next issue that we've been dealing with since then. All right? And that is that of transgenderism, or gender ideology, is the term that I'll use most. But as we've been eroding the meaning of our sexuality and what it's for, right? So with same-sex relations and marriage, you've removed the meaning of procreation from the sexual act. You've removed the biological complementarity from sexual relations. So if you remove complementarity from that, well then it's only one more step then to deny that maybe there is no difference between men and women at all. You know? But this cuts for us all the way to the denial of the integrity of body and soul in the human person. Right? So, gender ideology. And I've got some some of my examples here are a few years old, but it's hard to keep up on all the changes that happen in this area all the time. So, but some of the big name, moments that happened a few years ago. Bruce Jenner / Caitlyn Jenner, Olympic gold medal winner, TV personality in 2015, declared himself to be transgender. He ended his 23-year marriage, underwent cosmetic surgery. Would describe as being a woman as being a mental state and lifestyle. In one interview, he said, "The hardest part about being a woman," and all you ladies, here's the hardest part, right, "is finding out what to wear." Yeah. Do you think he knows what it means to be a woman? I would guess there's probably other things that other than finding clothes. But here's another example. Elliot Page, an actress, was in a same-sex marriage in 2018, but then in 2020 declared herself transgender, had surgery, said that when she was younger she felt she was a boy. "I wanted to be a boy. I'd ask my mom if I could be that someday." But an interesting thing is that, the background sometimes of this, I mean, she's religiously an atheist. But the interesting thing is that, so if the claim is that she never was a woman, she always was a boy, so does that mean she never had same-sex attraction when she was in a same-sex marriage? But that must mean her partner was never same-sex attracted either. So, I don't know. Suddenly everything becomes so confusing now. So what we're dealing with is the terminology from the medical terminology would be gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. So if someone feels strongly that they're not the gender they physically appear to be, and this discomfort with their body can be so intense that it interferes with the way that they function. And it can cause severe distress, anxiety, depression within them. And so one can find that those who have gender dysphoria, higher rates of mental conditions like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, depression, different parts to that. So we'll see here, we can recognize this is something that people experience, right? So sometimes people, if you don't agree with the way that I choose to live this out, if I want to be able to change myself from male to female, female to male, if you don't agree with that, then you are denying my existence, right? So obviously the church doesn't deny that condition like this exists, right? But what the church would say is not wise is the current state of how we've decided the treatment that will help these individuals will be. So the current goal in treatment is not to change how they feel about their gender, but instead the goal is to deal with the distress that comes from those feelings, even if dealing with the distress means surgeries and chemical, medications and things like that. Right? But this is very practical issues in our real world, as we've seen the last number of years. There's practical issues with regard to sports, right? And these are some older examples, but there's been constant examples since then of men competing, specifically men who claim to be women, participating in various women's sports, right? And the reason why that is so important is because there is a significant difference enough between them that it can remove fairness as well as cause potential injuries to the women who may be involved. And we can just look at, one small thing to see that there's a difference between men and women. When I was in high school, when I was in track, and my best event was the 800 meter, and I was faster than the fastest girl in the state. But competing against men, I didn't even qualify. Right. One of my previous parishes was in Elgin, Pope John. Here's their track records they have up in their up there. So you can compare the women and the men. So there's the 100 meter. So men were faster in that. 200 meter, men were faster. So in every single case, in every single record, the men's records are all faster than the women's records, right? So just there is a difference physically between men and women. And there's other differences as well between men and women as well. But that's why there are certain policies. I apologize, I did not look into, has this changed since then? Participation in sports and the use of locker rooms and bathrooms. That's the main two issues, the fairness within sports, but also the privacy issues about using bathrooms and locker rooms. The Nebraska Department of Education were proposing standards in 2021 that caused quite a stir, because when you actually read into the standards that they were going to teach in our public schools, you find some fairly disturbing things in there, very early ages. So like at kindergarten, you would discuss all sorts of these different relationships that would be proposed as normal for families, but traditional marriage was excluded from their teaching. Gender identity, we taught as early as first grade, sexual orientation in third grade, fourth grade, sexual orientation and gender identity, talking with them that, you might not be what you are when that you were assigned at birth, right? So these kind of ideas were put into the standards, and fortunately people were paying attention, and it didn't go through. I don't know if there's been attempts since then, but we want to continue to be wary of that. The kind of big focus on this culturally has caused young people greater confusion because they see this as something they could possibly be in their life. And we can see, especially in the realm of social media, these kinds of things can become trends. Hopefully, trends then can untrend quickly. So in Australia, there were youth at this time. This was at least in 2020. There were youth that were trying out being transgender because it was seen as something popular and cool, and people will respect me more, and I will, if I'm transgender, right? And so the condition actually came to have a name: rapid onset gender dysphoria, where this kind of a cultural contagion that rapidly onset. If we can see this in the statistics as to the percent of those who self-identify as transgender in orientation. So older generations, you see very, very small, 0.3, 0.2%. Then in millennials and Gen Z, you see it goes up to 1.2, 1.8% of adults. And so you can see that huge increase in the percentages, right? And so some people might say, well, that was because it was recognized, or people are more acceptant of that. But if that were the case, then one would expect a similar number in all generations, right? Because there would be those that do have transgenderism, regardless of what generation it is, but now they can finally, be open about it, right? But that huge gap going from a point, going up the percentage there, would seem to indicate that there is a cultural aspect to this 6 to 9 times greater percentage-wise. So let's look at our theology. How, as Christians, do we respond to this? Well, let's go, like as Jesus said, and Pope John Paul II did in his Theology of the Body. From the beginning, it was not so. Look back to the beginning. How did God create us? God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Right? So right away, we can begin to see why, as a church, we can't accept that men can become women and women can become men. Right? Because God created them uniquely individual in his image, after his likeness. Right? And we also learn that what does it mean to be made in God's image and likeness? It means that we have both a body and a spiritual soul. And at the moment that God creates us, he infuses our body with our spiritual soul that enables us to know and to love. Right? And so our soul goes with the body. There's an integrity there through creation. But what happened? What happened to us? Well, we know that original sin occurred. Right? The pain and suffering that came of the free choice of Adam and Eve. And so, all those disorders that we experience within our life, the fact that our body and soul do not always work well together, right? Our body and soul are at war with each other, is at play here as well, right? So, we are disordered. And so these thoughts of, am I really in the right body, points out that, something has gone wrong within the way that our bodies and souls function together, right? So the fact that it exists, there's no problem with us seeing that from our point of view of theology, right? We should expect disordered things to occur within the way that we look at ourselves, right? And so gender dysphoria would be an example of that. There can be, once again, a complexity as to what the origins of those might be, of why someone might be experiencing that specifically. But it's the same way with any kind of other disordered part of ourselves that we may be experiencing. There may be a complexity as to why that's our specific temptation. That's why it's our specific struggle. But this is fairly recent, so we don't have any big documents from the church on this specifically, but we do have the last 2 popes did reflect upon this issue. So this is in Pope Benedict. He wrote this while he was still pope in 2012. So I'm going to read. He's got a little. It's a section of it. I want to read it bit by bit. Man and woman as created realities, as the nature of the human being, no longer exist. So that's what he's saying. This is what happens with regard to gender ideology. That as us being created by God don't exist anymore. Man calls his nature into question. From now on, he's merely spirit and will. So in other words, my physical part of me doesn't matter. It's whatever I feel that I am. It's whatever I'm inside. I'm denying the fact that God has created me a certain way, right? The manipulation of nature, which we deplore today where our environment is concerned, now becomes man's fundamental choice where himself is concerned, right? So he points out the irony or the opposite way of thinking, that sometimes people that are supportive of transgender issues also are supportive of environmental issues. And so, as human beings, we have no right to manipulate our environment around us to abuse and change it, but we can do it to ourselves, as if we're not part of the natural world either, right? And so that's what he's pointing out, is that we've now decided we can manipulate ourselves into whatever we want ourselves to be, rather than receiving who we are from the Creator. Continues, but if there is no preordained duality of man and woman in creation, then neither is the family any longer a reality established by creation. Likewise, the child has lost the place he had occupied hitherto and the dignity pertaining to him. So he's saying it undermines this idea of the family, which requires the complementarity between mom and dad and their children. Now there is no complementarity between, there's no real difference between them, because the body doesn't matter. All that matters is how we think of ourselves. He continues, the most dangerous snare of this current thought is in fact the absolutation of man. Man wants to be absolutus, freed from every bond and from every natural constitution. He claims to be independent and thinks that his happiness lies in his own self-affirmation. This is a radical denial of the nature of the creature and child in man, which ends in tragic loneliness. Right, so what he's pointing out is, yes, there's this modern desire to, I can define myself apart from anything else and anyone else. But what he's pointing is that what happens is it leaves us in this tragic state where we are now alone. All worth and meaning are now defined by me. Right? Instead of our receiving our identity and our worth from a good God who's created us, now all my worth comes from my self-definition. And that is a very lonely thing, right? And all of my worth is just what I say it is. There's nothing outside of myself. It's a very lonely, a lonely thing. So that was John Paul II, that was Benedict. We've got a few little quotes from Pope Francis, because sometimes people will be like, well, Pope Francis, he certainly has accepted it, right? No, not really. Then there is the mistake of the human mind, gender theory, creating so much confusion. So the family really is under attack, right? So he's putting the same thing, right? The mistake of the human mind. He says this is a mental mistake, and it's this thought that I'm in the wrong body kind of thing is a perception. It doesn't match reality. Causes so much confusion, he says, and that's what it's been doing, especially to young people. So the family is really under attack. So he's reiterating what Pope Benedict had said, that this undermines family. The gender theory that does not recognize the order of creation, right? So he's saying it's denying the way God has created us, male and female, in his image and likeness. Another quote in one other place, he even says, gender ideology is demonic. Right? Because if you think about it, it is the same question that the ancient serpent posed to Adam and Eve, right? Reject your identity that you've received from God. You can decide for yourselves what is true, right? And so that's what's happening here, is gender ideology is denying that we have been created a certain way. And they will, and even sometimes terminology will be used that even by parents who are trying to help their children that may be struggling with gender dysphoria, not knowing what to do other than what society says you must affirm. They may even say things like, well, God doesn't make mistakes. God made my child this way. But that's a distortion. Because which mistake are you saying? You're saying God didn't make a mistake, so therefore they're in the wrong body. So you're saying God made their soul but didn't make their body. So there's this confusion that's there because oftentimes in our cultures presenting one version, and we haven't always known how to help families. Once again, those that are, just like when we talked about same-sex attraction, those that are experiencing this are not any, they're not any more disordered than anybody else. We're all disordered. It's just that this is a specific place in which the results of the fall, the results of original sin, have now affected the way they experience themselves, right? And all of us do it in different ways. So, but the issue with this in society right now is it's just like same-sex attraction, it's being pushed as a defining identity for people, right? No, you are someone who experiences gender dysphoria, but you are a beloved son or daughter of the Father, right? That's your true identity. I don't want to get too caught up in this, but when I've given this in other contexts, I bring up a whole bunch of other like science and stuff based in the back, so we can kind of see that our theology isn't opposed. The science actually kind of functions together. This was back in 2016 when this report, which was a summary of over 200 peer-reviewed studies in this area. Obviously, there have been other studies that have come up since then. But some of the findings in this and studies following that have not undermined any of this, is that with regard to gender identity, some people will claim that gender identity is this fixed, innate property within a human being. It's genetic, but that has not been found. There's no evidence for that, right? So there's no scientific studies that support that. It's a small percentage that experience gender dysphoria. Let's see. Comparing brain structures of individuals. There's not strong evidence to suggest that brain structures are different from those that experience transgender versus not. Let's see. Sex reassignment surgery. It's claimed that those who undergo through that surgery will help them accept, and they won't feel the distress of some of the other mental disorders that they have. Unfortunately, there's no, that is not true. There's no evidence that it does. I shouldn't say unfortunately, because, unfortunately for those who are told that it will, it doesn't, right? So that's not a real solution for people experiencing gender dysphoria. Let's see. Children are a special case with regard to transgender issues. It's only a very small minority of children who experience cross-gender identification that will continue to do so into adolescence and adulthood, right? And so that's an important thing to point, because it points out that just from a scientific point of view, it is not a good idea to transition children from one sex to another, because majority of them will not continue with identification into adulthood, and now you've done something that is going to affect their bodies. Let's see. Yes, delaying puberty for those that are experiencing gender dysphoria. There is no evidence that this gives a positive benefit for those. Let's see. Mental health outcomes. That overall transgender population are at a higher risk of various mental health issues. Obviously, that is not a good thing. The question about whether this has to do with discrimination or stigma from society not accepting them, there's only a weak connection there. Society has very much, in a greater way, accepted people that are dealing with gender dysphoria now, but many individuals are still experiencing that same kind of distress. Let's see. So if we look at the current treatment practices that are proposed, I mentioned earlier that the goal that people propose for this is not to change how the person feels about their gender, but instead it's how to deal with the distress that they have that comes from those feelings, right? And so therefore, psychotherapy and counseling is given, but that's only to affirm that, yes, you are in the wrong body, right? And in some places, there's even been a criminalization of trying to, if you're trying to help the person to help their perception match their the biological reality, that can be disallowed. Surface changes are often done, changing things like their dress, their names, their behaviors to match the stereotypes of the sex that they feel that they should be. But once again, that doesn't actually change who they are, right? Medicine or surgery also is only a surface change. It's a more drastic surface change, but adding hormones to suppressing physical changes, sex reassignment surgery, none of those things can actually change the core DNA of the person, right? The DNA is going to remain the same, right, regardless of whatever kind of mutilation one is trying to do to the body. Let's see here. I think it would be helpful to listen. This is Patrick Lampert, who is a plastic surgeon. He's a Catholic deacon. And he kind of, let's see here, I want to let him explain a little bit. I'll pause there. So that can help us kind of, he's looking at the various categories of certain disorders under obsessive compulsive disorder, and then specifically underneath that is body dysmorphic disorder, of which there's various varieties. And that's important to him, has been as a plastic surgeon, because there's a difference between, reconstructive surgeries where that, there's to remedy some kind of deformation due to disease or injury, versus aesthetic ones where someone may come to him and want certain bodily changes because they don't feel right, But, someone coming to a doctor or surgeon saying, I don't think this is my hand, you should remove it for me. The doctor is not going to do that, right? Because they realize, like he was describing, that in this disorder there is a delusion that there's an impossibility, that they have this obsessive idea that this impossibility is true, right? But the loving thing to do is not to affirm that disorder, right? So if you think about it, what would happen if? So currently, right now, for gender identity disorder, the practice of helping people is to affirm them, including things like surgeries and things like that, to affirm this dysphoria. But what if we were to do that same thing in other areas of body dysmorphic disorders, such as he said, anorexia, right? What if we were to do that for the young woman, the young girl who is anorexic, affirm her in that and say, you're right, you are overweight, right? What would that end up doing? It would kill her, right? She's going to kill herself, starving herself to death, right? So why suddenly now is that the way we should treat someone who has this other body dysmorphic disorder of, I feel because of some interior sorrow that's going on, that the solution of it's because I'm in the wrong body, right? And now suddenly society says we must affirm them in that, even with chemicals and surgeries, right? Let's go to the next one here.
But it has long been known.
There we go. All right. So you can see kind of subsets of various disorders, body dysmorphic disorder there, which includes things like anorexia, as well as gender identity disorder. All right. So where does this come from? Where does the dysphoria come from? Well, it could be complex as to where this interior sorrow or distress has come from. There may be pieces that are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual, trauma from earlier in life, though it may not necessarily mean that. In some cases, it's the suggestive power of the culture around us with social media and everything. Let's give you the science too a little bit when it comes to child development and gender identity. Some people will claim that children of a very early age are now transgender. But the reality is that, for example, age 3 to 4, they don't really have a concept of the boy and girl differences. 3 to 4, 4 to 6 is when they begin to recognize gendered behavior and exploring roles, but that's not gender confusion. Sometimes now in society, the normal natural exploration of roles of boys and girls will seem as like, oh, that girl likes to play with the truck, so therefore she must be a boy. Well, no, that's not what that means. This is a normal thing for children to explore various kinds of roles and figure things out. It's only ages 6 to 8 when they begin to see gender as being something stable. At 8 to 10, ability to think about it in a more abstract way. 10 to 24, to understand identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? You think about it. You got young people trying to figure out, who am I? What am I going to do with my life? So a lot of development goes on in adolescence. There's a very small percentage of youth who struggle with gender dysphoria, and only of that 1 to 3%, only 6 to 23% will that persist into adulthood, right? So it's a very small number. So if it's the case, and it seems to be from all of our evidence, our observations, that this confusion in childhood does not inevitably continue into adulthood, then it would be, then the question should be, should then hormones be given to delay puberty? Should we do surgeries and reassign sex of children? All of this would seem to indicate, no, this would be a bad idea just from a purely observational scientific point of view. I don't want to do something that would make their confusion permanent because it most likely will go out. But there has been different cases. This was a show in 2020, and there's been other cases of this, which this was chronicling the lives of 4 young people aged 15, 12, 7, and 4 and their families as they navigate growing up transgender. Right? So advocating that, any of these children can understand what this means. Look at the troubling origins of the surgery treatment that would be proposed. It was pioneered by 3 men in the 50s to the 70s, which were not the greatest guys. Dr. Alfred Kinsey believed that all sexual acts were legitimate, including pedophilia. Dr. Harry Benjamin collaborated in the first case of, at that time it was called transsexualism, so experimenting with, can a boy become a girl? Dr. John Money performed surgeries on a 2-year-old boy, David, and had the parents raise him as a girl. Of course, it was later discovered that Money was a pedophile and had abused him. And David had severe depression. By 12, he reversed the surgery by by 14, but then unfortunately he committed suicide as a young man, having gone through all of that. So that's the origins of how we came to those medical practices. That's where that came from. Johns Hopkins University performed the first surgery that was founded by Dr. Money. But there were no positive results that were found, and in 6 months, that original clinic was closed because it was clear at that time that it wasn't. But unfortunately, one of the other guys, Harry Benjamin, he created the standards of care, right? So those are the standards of care that have been used for how do we care for transsexual, transgender, gender nonconforming people. How do we care for them based upon what he says. All right. Another thing to be aware of is that when it comes to puberty-blocking drugs, it's used to lower levels of testosterone and estrogen that block the normal sexual development. It's used in other areas of medicine, including fighting cancer in adults. And reporting on one of the drugs that's used, a number of adverse reactions and serious cases of downsides. But yet these are chemicals we're saying are perfectly safe and good to use to transition people from one sex to another. One last kind of thing to kind of related to this is that people don't always think about another victim that can come from trying to, blur the lines with regard to locker rooms and bathrooms, is that you're now causing a potential unsafe environment, especially for women, if you're allowing a man who is biologically a man to now share the same space. You have women who are survivors of sexual trauma, and now they're being forced to be in a space that should be safe for them, but now can no longer be safe. And this is, of course, not saying that someone that a transgender person is automatically someone who is seeking to, attack somebody else. But unfortunately, when those laws and rules have changed to allow that to occur, then there have been criminals who have taken advantage of that, right? And the law says I can be here, and as long as all I have to do is claim that this is I'm a woman, and now I can be here and I can do whatever I want in this area, and that's not right. So what should be done to help those with gender dysphoria? Well, we love everyone, all those who are hurting, those who are wounded, and we all have these spiritual wounds within us. Right? And this is a significant spiritual wound that's causing someone to question their very identity as to who they are, right? So, we begin by, as we would with anybody who's struggling through any kind of difficulty. We may not be able to solve everything in their life, but we want to begin to walk with them. We want to listen to them. We can be the person's friend. Trying to show that we care for the person. There's a difference between someone who, may be struggling with it and open to, friendships and hearing what the church has to say versus someone who is very militantly against. You might not be able to do much for someone who is not open in that way. But ultimately what we want to do is we want to help, just like we'd help anybody who has a delusion, who has this thought that we want to assist them to help their perception match with reality. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do, and it may require professional assistance, which, if society, disallows that kind of assistance, then it becomes even more difficult to help individuals. I'd say what's even more important for our young people is to counteract the lies of the world around us, right? So if we can see how social media and how this has brought about, rapid onset gender dysphoria, we want to protect our young people from this. So that's why we talked about, the foundational principles that come from the theology of the body, right? Of understanding that God has made us in His image and likeness, male and female. He has made boys and girls, and our bodies make us unique from one another. We all have unique gifts and talents, and to help guard against that kind of potential confusion that society can bring, this kind of mental contagion from some of that. So, be, very good to, watch very closely about the kinds of social media and the ideas and things that people are getting, that kids especially are getting online about that. So they're protected from some of those ideas that can erode someone from very young and bring them greater confusion. So, hopefully you found that helpful to reflect the last number of times on some of these big issue topics that are talked about all the time. Hopefully you feel a little bit better, what do we understand? How do we explain it? How can I talk to somebody about why the church's teachings are the way they are? Sometimes just if all you hear about it is it's pounded in our face all the time as to like this is good and you should accept this. You never hear or reaffirmed that no, there is a solid truth as to who we are as human beings, the way that God has made us, right? So hopefully this can strengthen our understanding. So any questions, thoughts, anything? That finishes our theology of the body stuff. So. All right. Nobody has any questions? One of the things coming up, so we're getting closer to the end of Lent. One of the things we'll need to do, I was going to give you the practice time. Let me pull up my calendar here. So, Holy Saturday is April 19th. There is, the Masses are at 8:30. Some of you are going to be at Hartington. Some of you are going to be in Osmond for that. For the Osmond one, we're going to have a practice so that you can feel more comfortable when you're up in front of people and you kind of know what you're going to do. So we're going to practice ahead of time. We practice with the servers and all that as well. So for the Osmond one, we'll practice at 1 p.m. There at the church. I don't know yet what time Father Cordy's going to... Actually, let me quickly go back to last year.
So we're doing this on the 19th?
On the 19th, yeah. So just earlier that day. And it won't take too long, but we're just going to help you walk through it so you feel comfortable. And so at the practice, obviously at the Mass itself, you want to make sure that your sponsor is there. If they can come to the practice, that would be great too, because then you can practice together. You're welcome to have your families come and join us for the Mass in the evening. Even if they're not Catholic, they can come. And usually we have you guys sit up in the front, and so you'll have reserved spots for family to participate. So let's see. I was looking last year. Okay, I don't have it on my calendar when Father Cordy. I'll get that to you. I'll ask him what he would like to do for practice time. The other thing, just to have in your mind coming up on our schedule, and this will be one of I'm pulling our schedule up here. So prior to the Easter Vigil, for those that for the candidates that are already baptized, you'll need to participate in the sacrament of reconciliation if you haven't yet. And so we can do that as part of either next week's class or April 15th is during Holy Week. So we just have two classes left. Well, we can do reconciliation. So next week, would that work for people? If you're unable to come that night too, you can set up individual times, for myself, or if you'd rather go to Father Cordy, you can do that too. However you'd like, but we can do it. We can have reconciliation beginning of class next week, and then after we finish that, then we can continue. So if you remember on the Google Drive, there is resources for preparing, examining your conscience, and preparing. And I'll send a link to that out again, and my video again for how do I go to confession. So you can review that and look at that. So that way you don't feel nervous or as nervous going to the sacrament. So if that sounds good, we'll do that at the beginning next time. All right. Any questions? Things that I'm not thinking about with regard to the coming sacraments?
On the sacraments, I was thinking about, like, after we have the Holy Saturday and us, we're actually part of the church then, are we still having classes after that then too?
So I had scheduled that we would have at least one, but now that I look at my schedule, so we have, so the obviously usually we wouldn't meet the week or so we got Holy Saturday on the 19th, and then that Tuesday night, Osmond School has their spring concert, so probably yes. So I should be at the spring concert too. And then the 29th is actually there's a priest jubilee. Well, actually, wait. Priest jubilee is earlier. 4 p.m. I don't know if I'll be able to. It's in Fremont, so I don't think I'll probably be able to get back here in time. The dinner doesn't start until 4, so I might not be able to get back here in time. So might not be able to make the 29th, but and then we get into May. I could, unless we do it a different day. But I could meet the 6th on May. But it'd be nice to meet one last time, just to, of course, one of the purposes of meeting afterwards is to talk about our experience of that, and if it's like 3 weeks after that. And I don't want to be like, well, now you're Catholic, good luck, you're on your own. It's like, it'd be nice to meet one last time. But yeah, it doesn't look like 22nd or 29th. Are people opposed to doing the 6th? All right, we can. All right, I'll put us down for the 6th so far. We have a couple more classes, so if anything comes up between now and then, we can talk about it. So, all right. Anything else? Yep.
Are we still having class next?
We will be still having class, yes. So we'll do confession first, and then depending upon how long it takes us, maybe it'll take the whole class. Maybe we'll have some time at the end. We'll see. So, yeah. All right. Very good. Nothing else? All right. All right, hold on. Let me stop my recording.